I'm Lucinda Laughlin. Welcome to WAVE, Channel 20, Auburn Community Television, in this episode of Meet the Artist. Nick Vogt is our guest today. He is a watercolor painter. He has a very non-traditional style of working with watercolors, and you will find that his focus is primarily on buildings of historical significance. I just bet when you see some of his artwork, you're going to recognize several buildings and places. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So let's start out by talking a little bit about your background and how you started out and got here today.
Well, I started out painting when I was about 7 or 8 years old and was with paint by numbers. But one of the things that got me into landscapes and so forth is where I was raised and grew up. For example, I'm just going to use some of my art to explain my little story here. But I was born in the Jones Hospital at Queen Anne Victorian in Grass Valley. And this is now a bed and breakfast, but that's where I was born. And that was the first hospital in Nevada County. So I had to do a painting of that.
Now, when did you paint this one?
This one I painted relatively recently. But it's depicted of a scene in 1950 because I was born in 1950.
And that's one of the things I love, is because you do backdate to that time period in which you're drawing them.
Right.
And what a great thing to have to kind of show your history.
Right. This is called Birth of Fall at Jones Hospital. And then I grew up on a ranch. If some of you are familiar with Lake Wildwood down below Grass Valley, before the lake was there, that's where I grew up. And it was a cattle ranch, but later on, my parents raised sheep. So this picture here is called Guardian Shepherd, and it's got some hidden pictures in it. This one is not a watercolor, it's a pen and ink, but there's a lot of figures in the background.
Now, when you first started out, were you doing pen and ink?
No, I just do this every once in a while,
I see.
just for fun, when I don't have my paints with me. But this took a little while to do, so it's a kind of a neat pen and ink. Even today, people really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's what that one's all about. And I, believe it or not, I went to a one-room school called Pleasant Valley School, and we had one teacher, 11 kids, and the teacher was very influential also in my art. None of my family members were artists, so. She herself was not an artist, but she taught every subject and actually did quite well with art also. And I like to kid about this one because the little girl there running towards the school, that's my sister. She's got a couple of PhDs. I call her the student. The boy in the overalls running away from school, that's my brother. He still wears overalls today and hasn't done quite as much as what she's done.
So scholastic was not his journey in life, but it certainly was hers.
Well, he did get into scholastics a little bit, but he's just kind of an interesting character. I'll just put it that way.
Okay.
All right.
And so have you always lived in the Placer County or the Nevada County area?
There was a time where I lived down in Southern California when I
Okay.
was working in ministry. I'm a minister now, full-time, and I do art on the side along with coaching athletes too.
So you went to school. So where is this one-room schoolhouse?
This is right near our ranch. What I say near, it's about 1.5 miles from where we grew up on the ranch. But we had to walk to school every day.
Okay, but where was it located?
In Pleasant Valley, which
Okay.
is down by near Lake Wildwood.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then so what brought you up to Northern California then?
Well, I was born in Northern California. So
But you went to Southern California.
just for a short time,
Okay.
in ministry, and then came up here and got a change in ministry focus. So came up here and work with Christian Team Ministries now.
All right, so as I've indicated when I introduced you, that you kind of do a non-traditional style of using watercolor. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is talking about that non-traditional style.
Okay.
Because it is really interesting, because you do use watercolors in a way that most people do not. So let's talk about, first off, is the one that you have brought a short video of how you go through the steps in creating your artwork.
Right.
So let's talk about the first one, which I believe is over my shoulder.
Yes.
And what is this one called?
I call that morning worship in Nevada City, and it's of the historic Methodist Church in Nevada City on Broad Street. And that started out as a pencil sketch first. That's how I do all my paintings. I do a sketch, and I call it still loose and kind of even, but it's probably more detailed than most watercolorists, because it is buildings, and I want to get the perspective correct and get a little bit of detail suggested in there before I start painting.
So when you do the sketch, is that with pencil?
Pencil,
or? Okay.
yes. I always use pencil, and a pencil that when I paint the watercolor, some of the pencil will show through. If you look at the shingles, for example, right at the top of the church, you'll see that some of the pencil shows through in the shingles, and so that's the transparency of watercolor.
Now, so you start out, you do your pencil sketch, and you're using watercolor paper.
Right.
So you do the pencil sketch,
Right.
and then you come in right over that, starting with the watercolor.
Usually what I do is wet the entire paper front and back, and I have an easel that tilts every direction, sideways, up. One boy saw me painting a painting and said, "Oh, you're painting upside down," because when you put the pigment on the paper and start mixing it on the paper, and you tilt it, it runs, and it creates that cloud effect that you can see in the clouds up there, the rain effect coming down.
Now, why do you wet the back of the paper?
I want to keep it wet a little bit longer when I'm working on it. So when you wet the back, it does that.
I see. So you have the back and the front, and then as you're working, so you're actually are working wet on wet, even
wet
with
on wet
your
when we start with, right? And as we go through it, a watercolor is transparent, so you have one layer on top of another, and by putting one color on top of another, it can change the color of what you see underneath, or what you see at the end.
Now, with the one that we have the example of, how long did it take you from beginning to end with that particular painting?
That took quite a while, because what I do is I work on it for a while. The wet on wet parts goes pretty quick, but sometimes I'll re-wet an area. For example, in the foreground of that one, I wet that again, just that area, to get the reflections of the street, of the rain and the glitter and on the street, and the reflections and shadows of the people and the automobile and the fence and that sort of thing.
So when you go in with that detail that you have, because that's the thing that's so remarkable about your paintings, is just that level of detail.
Right, and that'll usually come later. Some you can get, believe it or not, with wet on wet, because a watercolor painting can paint itself as you go. But the detail, the fine line, the fine brush detail is on dry at that time. And so you start with your light colors and you move towards your darks. You attempt to keep all your whites or your lights open. For example, a lot of that painting in there that's white is left paper white. I just didn't put anything on that.
Do you ever then go back in and put something over it? Or?
You can use a white watercolor and go over to highlight and so forth.
Now, with the white, is that...
It's a white watercolor paint.
It is.
And you just put it on a little more opaque.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
That's usually a dry.
So what I think is always amazing is, like I said, is the detail even in the clothing that they're wearing, and particularly with the church, is all of that very, very fine line. Now, I assume that you're working with all kinds of different sizes of brushes.
Yeah, you can use a broad brush for the wet on wet. And believe it or not, I'm one of the artists that use pretty much the same size brush from then on.
Oh, interesting.
But it's a brush I've had for years, probably 15, 20 years, if not longer. And comes right to a point. You can get detail with it. So it's just one of my favorite brushes.
Now, because it's watercolor, you are working with with the pigment, and then you're mixing the water to the pigment. Is that how
Sometimes
this works?
you mix in your palette, but sometimes you can mix directly on your paper
Now,
when it's wet.
When you're going with this very intense color that you get, which is another thing that's very unique about your work. Is that because you're using more pigment than water, or is the ratio a lot different then?
Yeah, my final pigments, and if you look up to the left on the trees, it's almost opaque on some of the shadows, those kind of purple shadows in that tree. So those will, but it's still not, that's a problem that some watercolorists have. When they do that, their colors get muddy. And so you got to be, this style you can get layer onto layer, and I usually put contrasting colors next to one another, oranges with blues and so forth, to get that contrast.
It intensifies the...
Yeah, and you get that popping, that
oh, definitely, you achieve that in your work.
Yeah.
Well, now that we've kind of gone through the step-by-step process in how you create your work, then let's go and let's talk a little bit more about some of the work that you've done. And the one that we have like center place here is the Auburn Courthouse. And let's talk about this, because this is in the snow. And I've only lived here 5 years, and I've honestly not seen that amount of snow. So I'm assuming that some winters you maybe get this kind of level of snow?
Yeah, there have been years where we've had snow in Auburn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I
live in Meadow Vista, and it hardly ever snows, but one year it snowed so hard that oak limbs came down, and one crashed right through our car. But it made some great painting too with that snow that we don't usually get even on our property.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I like about your paintings as well, is that you take something that we see every day and then you bump it up with something, either a historical aspect about it, or here is the snow as well as the historical.
Yes.
Now, do you use photographs to start out with? Is that, or do you usually go and...
What I like to do is actually go
them?
out and do the sketch, right on spot. And then I will take photos for reference and that sort of thing. Some people, when they look at my work, and if they have a photo that they took of the same subject, they'll notice that it might be, slightly different color, or sometimes a vastly different color, but they don't notice it up front, when they look just at the painting. And that's the expressionism that comes through in the painting.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So you're bringing something familiar, but making it, so you really don't even notice it until later, and then you go, oh, wow, look at this. Look what you've done.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm kind of known for the bold, bright colors and the detail. And, and sometimes I'll even change things. I'll turn a whole building around in a different direction.
Now, obviously, when you did the courthouse, the cars are older cars, which would probably be in the, 30s or 40s time frame that we're talking about?
Yeah, it depends on the paintings, what period I want to depict. And so that'll change with, like, some paintings of like a Bridgeport covered bridge, for example. I'll put a stagecoach and horses in there. Other times it's automobiles, but the vintage that I want to depict in that time period. Well,
and that's, like I said, you take an image that we see every day, and then you've taken us back in time.
Right. That's what I'm trying to do.
And it is. It's quite a trip.
Yeah. Thank you.
One of the other ones I'd like to talk about in that vein is the one that's actually over your shoulder, which is of the Tahoe Club. And I love this one because you don't see very many paintings of the Tahoe Club. And even when you drive down the street, I think that you miss the Tahoe Club.
Right, because people are concentrating on driving or walking. People even walking don't notice it.
Well, it seems like it gets obscured in other things, but I love the fact that you've now brought this awareness of this absolutely gorgeous building.
Right.
Now tell me a little bit about the photograph and the things that you did in this painting that actually took it to the time period and then brought clarity to it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is I found an old photograph, that was the only one I found of the Tahoe Club, other than one when they were building it, which I think was in 1917 or whatever. And the photograph was, black and white, pretty rough. It was cut off on the bottom, but it had the old church in the background. So when people look at that, and they'll all of a sudden say, "Wait, I don't know where that is."
Yeah, I don't drive into a church.
Right, but that's in that intersection now. But that's how I bring some of the quality back in. Another thing to get that age and that significance is you see the Coca-Cola written on the
Yes.
brick building, and that's not there right now. And I like fish and chips and everything, but that for years was known as the coffee cup, spelled with a K, coffee, and K with a cup. So I enlarged that sign a little bit because a lot of times there's people who grew up here who remember that, and that's very significant. That was coffee cup for years.
Now, what I also love about when you do a painting like this, that you can correct things that actually interfere with
Oh yes.
photograph, and you've done that with this particular one as
Right.
well.
The old photograph I saw had a telephone pole right in front of the front door. And of course, that doesn't help at
No.
all. And then, so I moved it, and there is a telephone pole on that street, but it's not even there. It's actually would be to my right, you know, so you wouldn't even see it. So I wanted to get that back in there to capture the eye and then bring it back around in a circular motion, the viewing of the painting, and bring it back up again.
And it certainly does that. I think it anchors to this one side, and then your eye does get to do that
Right.
circular.
And that's the way a person looks at a painting. They usually enter it and they come around and then they come back into it again. And so it's important to have things that colors and shapes. You want to have interesting corners on each corner of your painting, and you want to be able to have a good composition so something's not exactly in the center cutting your painting in half, but you have various subshapes in your painting.
And the other thing that you do very well is you want to make sure that your light is coming from the same source.
Right, that's correct. Yeah.
You don't want it coming from all over
Right.
the place, and you
Yeah.
do that so well. Now the other is that, again, in this one, is you have the old cars.
Right.
And I'm sure, were the old cars in the photograph?
There was only one car in the photograph, and that was that little one right in front. I just moved it to the other side of the street because it was driving the wrong way. And so I wanted to have it drive the right way. And it was actually parked, and so I wanted a person driving it. And the other cars I put in there, you know, I looked at some photos and that sort of thing and have an idea what they looked like in the late 30s, early 40s, and put them back in.
And so you're drawing from a lot of different photographs in bringing this composition together.
Right, or just memory of things. On some of those cars, you know, you just kind of know how to paint them in, you know.
And I love the dynamics of the sky in this one, that dark blue that you've achieved here. And with watercolor, I think that dark blue is sometimes very difficult to achieve.
Not really.
Oh, really? 'Cause
Probably
I've found
harder
it-
for you as a pastel artist
Well,
to get the
I was
dark
going to
blue,
say
right?
it is very hard. No, red
But
is what's really
red's hard too,
Yes.
and you can get a really deep red and very deep blue in watercolor, and sometimes it is putting your pigment on a little heavier than you normally do. But if you look at the angles, somebody said, well, paint, I think it was my wife, she says, well, you don't need the flagpole in that, and you need to get more of the building in. But the flagpole is a very important part of that building. It was there from day one, you know. And I'm glad I left it in there because some of the Tahoe Club is an all-men's club, so one of those guys saw that and they said, oh, good thing you put the flag in, you know.
Yes.
So it's very important to have
So for
that
them, it was
historical
very much-
significance of that flag.
Well, I think it helps to
So-
draw that eye up and expand
Right.
that circle a little bit more this way as opposed to just right along the buildings.
But all the photographs, well, they only saw one a photograph, but even when I did it, it was a summer day, it was a straight blue sky. Well, that would have caused some difficulty with the composition of the painting, so you'll notice that the clouds come down on an angle
Yes.
to match the angle of the building coming up, so you got this dynamic coming together.
Well, it's absolutely gorgeous.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Now, another one that we're going to be doing is Machado.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one that, again, I think all of us have driven by this building a lot. Some of us have attended the Machado Fair or Festival.
It was there this last Saturday. I was there.
And I understand that you always have a booth up at the Machado Festival.
And this time, Shawnee Machado put me right underneath the oak tree. So I was right there.
So tell me about what you did to create this particular painting.
Well, this one, I as I mentioned, I coach athletes, and I was coaching a cross-country meet. And so I came late to Machado's, and it was cloudy. When I got there, I started sketching it. So this was 2 years ago. And as I sketched it, it started to rain. So you can't do watercolor in the rain. Well, I guess you could, and you have a lot. You'll have a very interesting painting. I may try it someday.
It really would be wet.
Right, but be wet on wet for a long time. So anyway, I took it home, and then the next year, which was last year, Shawnee invited me to be there again, and I said I better get this painting done. So I worked on it pretty diligently, and got it completed, and just in time, like a day before that last year's fair. So.
So tell me about, because the people, because I understand that there are elements of this that you have inserted, because you were actually at, was it the Gold County Fairgrounds?
The Gold Country Fair.
The Gold Country Fair.
Country Fair, and I helped with at that year I was helping put artists in the building. This year we had the whole building, which was neat, 60 artists in there. But last year I was painting on this, and that's when this little boy came up, and he says, "Mommy, Daddy, he's painting upside down." And I had this painting tilted upside down and letting that run. And it was pretty early in the painting, so a lot of it was still sketch. And I had a little boy sketched in the corner, and I looked at him and I said, "Man, you're about the same age as this little boy. Maybe I'll put you in there." He had red hair, bright blue eyes, and all that. Well, his parents heard that, and they said, "I've heard you say that. Can you put him in there?" And I said, "Sure." So I had them send me a photograph of him posing, eating an apple like I had sketched in the painting. And I just put him in.
Oh, that's exciting. I bet that was exciting for him.
Yeah, I think it was, yeah.
Now, also you told me that you had to insert another image in this in order to kind of fill in an area.
So one of the things that was happening is if you come right down here, you see where it comes down to a kind of a point. That was before we had Bubba in there, the boxer. Bubba is a well-known commodity there at the Machado's. He's everywhere. And so I said, I need something to put in there, and I didn't want to put a pumpkin or something like that. The eye was kind of running off where this comes together in this V. So I said, I'm going to put Bubba in there. And if he looks right at you, and that brings you out of the painting, and then you come back in again to the left.
Yes, definitely. And again, you have the old vehicles, and tell me about the truck, because there's something about your family in that truck.
Right, I always try to get something in there historical, sometimes of our own family. So as I mentioned earlier, I grew up on a ranch, and it was a cattle ranch. But the truck has in it the Lazy BV for Bill Vogt. Both my dad and grandfather, who bought the ranch together, were both William. So that was a Lazy BV.
So this is a part of your family that is preserved in this particular painting.
Right, and then on the little truck here to the right, that's SK Fencing, and that's my brother-in-law, who has a fencing business.
All right, so then we have another one that I think that a lot of people, we go to various things in Old Town Auburn. And if you could tell us a little bit about this particular painting.
This I did right on location during, I think it was the first Wine and Art Festival, or Art and Wine Festival. I don't know which way it went. And they had all the streets closed down. I think they still do it today, but they just have one little area over this way, one little parking lot area where they do it in. But it was interesting. There's a lot of people walking around and so forth. And I wanted to capture again, you know, a good area of Auburn. So we have the courthouse in it. We have, you know, the winery and so forth in there, and post office, you know, all of this in there. And you probably know where I'm standing, right?
Oh yeah, you're over here in front of, isn't it?
You can
brewery,
tell where I was, right? Where I was taking it.
Well, yes, you're alluding to the fact that you have the painting that's right there.
I have the painting of the painting.
Yes.
So you know where I'm standing, and that's my easel, which I've had for since 1966. I made it way back in 1966.
Now the other thing about this is that you actually had people that posed for you. So did you take the photographs of them that you could later put them in?
Well, first I sketched them in. it was getting close to the end of the day because for a plein air style of painting, this detail is a lot more time consuming. So I was there, and it was hot that day.
Yeah.
It was really hot. I was having trouble even keeping my paper wet, you know. But I wanted to get people in there, and it was getting almost over. And these people over here that are sitting down, they were already packing up. And I said, hey, don't take your art down yet. I'm still painting it, and I want to get you in there.
And I love it because they're in there as well as you got a little bit of their own artwork in here.
Right.
So there is so much composition in this picture.
And they didn't want to be in the picture because their hair was a mess and everything. It was a hot day, and they said, can we just turn around and sit down? I said, sure, that's fine. These people were coming down. You could see the child falling asleep there, and they were thrilled to be in the painting, so I sketched them real fast. And this lady happened to be there now. I put her on a diet. She's probably 50 pounds lighter in the painting because I thought if she ever saw this, you know, I want to compliment her because she had beautiful hair.
And she does, and how she's looking out
and looking at.
Yes.
Yeah. And this fella just was intrigued by this, and he said, yeah, I'll look at this art longer because I kind of enjoyed it. And anyway, but I did snap a photo of him also, you know, for reference, for color and that sort of thing.
Well, you know, we're going to have to move along very quickly and just briefly mention the fact that you also do traditional watercolors, and you did bring an example of that.
Yeah,
and that
I call
is
it semi-traditional.
Semi-traditional.
Yeah.
You still quite don't get to the traditional. And we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on it, but if you could just explain real quickly the difference between that traditional, which is the barn behind you, and with the other stuff that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit less detail. It's a lot of wet on wet, a little more transparent. And what's interesting about that is that's the barn that was on our ranch. It was torn down in 1970, so I did it from memory, but also a sketch I did when I was, I think I was a sophomore in high school.
But you also still brought your very intense colors.
Right.
You know, you have so much for people to see, and you're going to be in the Placer Art Studio tours. And
November
that's
10, 11, 12.
12th. And if you could please tell our viewers where you are on that tour, and also how they can get in contact with you, because I am sure there are people that are really going to want to see more of your work.
Well, they can get in touch with me with my email address, which is nvogt@christianteam.org, like a team of athletes, christianteam.org, NVOGT. And to see my paintings, what I'm going to do is refer you to the website of the Placer Art Studios Tour, which is placerartstudiostour.org or com. Com. So go to there and look me up. I'm number 4 in the Studios Tour. So it's not I'm the 4th best artist. They just start in Colfax and they work down. So, but yeah, make sure you go and see that. There's 100 artists and 42 locations in the tour. A lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the time.
Well, thank you.
And I want to thank you for tuning in to WAVE Channel 20, Auburn Community Television, in this episode of Meet the Artist. Meet the Artist is supported by the North Auburn Artists to introduce artists in our local community. Who knows, maybe there's an artist living just around the corner.